So the next lecture will be about physically based rendering. And before I start, I'd like to ask, how many of you are 3D artists or interested in 3D graphics? Most of you. Awesome. And how many of you have used physically based rendering systems or know what physically based rendering is? Quite a lot. All right. It's cool. Well, for those who do not know what it is, I'll do my best to shed some light on it. But before I go to the actual presentation, let me introduce myself. So my name is Miro Vesterinen. I'm currently finishing up my studies at Kajaani University of Applied Sciences. And I'm a 3D games artist with a couple of years of experience in game development. Last year I was at Fragment Production in Tampere, developing Rescue Everyday Heroes that got released on Steam last December, if I remember correctly. There's some stuff I do, but really that's enough about me. So let's move on to the actual presentation. So the content of this presentation is, at the beginning, I'll do my best to explain what physically based rendering means. It's also called physically based shading often, but those mean the same thing. After that, I move on to some theory behind physically based rendering, but not the math and graphics programming, but I'll be talking about what happens when light hits an object or a surface, and explain some of the material parameters that you need to understand to create texture maps for physically based rendering systems. After that, there's the practice part. So how does this knowledge translate to practice? And how do we actually create texture maps for physically based rendering systems? And at the end of this presentation, there will be some time for questions. So if you have any, please hold them to the end of the presentation. OK. So physically based rendering is a new standard. And it refers to a concept of using realistic lighting models along with measured surface values to represent the real-world materials we see. And the biggest difference to the traditional system is the more detailed behavior of light and surfaces or materials. It's not really a new thing or new concept. It has been already used by film industry for quite a few years. So it has been used in movies such as The Iron Man and Monsters University. And it's a new standard, so basically all the big three, Unreal Engine 4, the new CryEngine, and Unity 5, have moved on to a physically based rendering system, as well as multiple in-house engines, such as the Fox engine. And the benefits of using a physically based rendering system is that it gives us a consistent look on the different lighting environments. And this is because of the fact that we have more detailed light and surface material definition. As you can see, well, you can almost see the camera lenses there lit in 4 different environments. And the materials react as they would in real world. The parameters are also based on real-world values. So it's easier for artists to understand what he's working with, since it's something that you can actually somehow measure or calculate from real world. And with these two things combined, it's easier to achieve photorealistic results. But what's problematic with physically based rendering is the multiple implementations of it. So it's a concept. It's not really a set of rules that define you have to do things like this, you have to do things like that. So it makes it problematic for us artists to create content, since it might not work. It might work in one engine, but might not work in a different engine. And since we have a lot more detailed surfaces and lighting, it's important that the artists understand what happens when light actually hits a surface, and what are the things that make materials like they are in real world. So first of all, when light hits a solid object, in this case, there's the diffusion which means the surface property that represents light reflected at many angles. So what actually happens is that the light hits the object surface, actually goes within the surface, scatters around, bounces around within the object, and while doing this, some of the light's wavelengths are being absorbed and turned to heat mainly. And after that, after bouncing a while, the light is being bounced off from the surface to all directions. And this diffusion defines the color of the surface. And this is because when some of the light's wavelengths are gone, you get the rest in your eyes and you see a color. We'll also be talking a bit about albedo, which comes from Latin, meaning whiteness. And it's basically the percentage of how much the light is being reflected back during the diffusion. And it's not really a mystical concept. Basically, everyone knows that black objects or dark objects absorb more light and create more heat. So black clothes in a hot summer day are a nightmare. Okay. Cool. And then we also have reflection, which is the surface property that represents light being reflected into a single outgoing direction. So in its basic form, the light simply bounces off the surface. And the color of the reflection is generally the color of the light, because the light doesn't actually go inside the object, so it doesn't lose any of its wavelengths. But for certain materials, mainly metals, the color of the reflection can also be tint to it. And this is, for example, in case of gold, it gets that yellowish orange tint. So these two basic concepts aren't really that new. If you have been making 3D graphics, you have been making diffuse maps and specular maps. So this is the basic concepts of how these things actually work. But with physically based rendering system, there's a new thing called energy conservation, which means that the light leaving the surface is never any brighter than that which fell upon it originally. And this basically means that the reflection and diffusion are mutually exclusive. You can't have both, because then you somehow multiply the lighting that came to the object. And as you can see from the spears there, the reflectivity is a dominant force. So basically, if the object has 100% reflectivity, none of the light actually goes inside the object, and you won't see any color on the object surface. This basic understanding of reflection makes it easy for us to categorize real-world materials into two simple groups. So we have our insulators and conductors. So the insulators being your basic wood, rock, plastic. And it's common for them to have really low level of reflectance, so usually between 1 to 20%. And most of the materials are actually between 2 to 6%. And when the insulators is lit with a white light, the reflection appears also white. So it doesn't tint the reflection color. Then we have the conductors, which are the other end of the spectrum, so basically metals and materials such like that. And they have commonly reflectance value of 60 to 90%. And the reflection can also be tint, for example, in case of gold or copper. And in theory, these conductors do not show any evidence of diffuse light. And this is because either the material is too dense for the light to enter the object, or all the light is already been absorbed or reflected back. And knowing this basic categorizing into these two groups brings us a new texture map called metalness or metallic map, which in its basic form is a mask that defines whether the material is an insulator or a conductor. And as you can see, my example spears there, there's the plastic ball and a golden ball or sphere. But what we need to understand about reflectance is also that it's not actually a constant value, but because of Fresnel effect, the reflectivity is is different from different angles. And on grazing angles, the reflection becomes total on all smooth materials. Yeah. So as you can see, that black sphere I have there, it's smooth, but yet it shows a lot more reflectivity on the sides because of the angle. Can't really see the reflection that well, but you can imagine it there. And luckily, this is something that we don't really need to worry about that much as an artist. This is usually done by the shader, and it gets the curve from a base reflectance value. But again, that was for all smooth materials. Not all materials are smooth. So we have this thing called Microsurface, which is basically the small imperfections on the surface. It's something that you can't really see with your plain eyes. So it's hard to define what it really is. But basically, the rougher the surface is, the more the reflected light will scatter around and appear more blurry. And again, this is not really a new concept. We have been using gloss maps and specular maps in the last, in the traditional systems as well. But with physically based rendering, the energy conservation comes into play again. So the rougher the surface is, the larger the reflection highlight appears, and which makes it dimmer, and smaller highlights are a lot more stronger. And this is again because the light scatters around, so there won't be as much light on the bigger area unless we somehow multiply the light from the source. So to recap that basic theory, what happens when light hits an object. So we have diffusion. Some of the light goes inside the object, scatters around, and bounces off to multiple different directions. And this defines the color and the albedo of the surface. Then we have reflection, which is the bright specular reflection that bounces straight off the surface. And the material defining into insulators and conductors. So really low level of reflection versus the really high levels of reflection. And the microsurface that defines how rough the surface is. And the new features that come with physically based rendering systems, energy conservation. So no light leaving the surface is never brighter than which fell upon it originally. And the Fresnel effect, which affects the reflection from, the reflections differ from depending on the angle it's viewed, the surface is viewed. But how does all this translate to practice when creating texture maps? That's really what everyone wants to know. So like I mentioned in the beginning, physical-based rendering relies on real-world data or real-world values. So almost all of these are measurable somehow by scanning real-world materials. And the scanned data leads to less guesswork for artists. And it also leads to consistency between artists, since everyone has the same base to start creating their texture maps. But you need to understand it's not just painting by numbers, even though you have accurate data. There's also space for artistic freedom. And for workflow-wise, the use of specular maps is quite different with physically based rendering systems, or even the complete lack of the specular maps. Also, some old approximations can now be discarded, since we have new hardware and a lot more computing power. And the use of smoothness or roughness map, so what defines the microsurface of the object. And there is a pixel of Quixel megascans, which is a service that provides scanned data for physical-based rendering systems. But before moving on to the actual texture creation, I'll briefly talk about linear and gamma values. So this is not really a huge emphasis, but kind of good to know stuff when creating the texture maps. So most engines support both gamma and linear values. but most of the shaders actually do the calculations in linear space. So it's important to know what kind of input the shader actually wants. And it's also important to know that the linear value of 0.5 isn't actually 128, which would be the middle point between 0 and 255, but it's 186, 186, 186. And this is because when converting linear values to gamma values, we need to raise them by the inverse of gamma, 2.2. And you can see the simple calculation there, which defines the 0.5 for gamma. But now let's move on to the actual texture maps. So generally, there are still 4 inputs. There's the diffuse, the specular, microsurface, or reflection and microsurface, as well as the normal map. So not really that much hasn't really changed. But as you can see, I talked about the multiple different implementations. So there's the what Marmoset toolbag and what Unreal Engine 4 called these maps. So they don't have any same names. So it usually mixes up as an artist really easily. But let's move on to the first texture map, which is the diffuse map. So the diffuse map should rely on some physically based albedo value. And as you can see, I have like this sheet there on the right, which shows some basic albedo values for some common materials. What's really different from traditional models is that the diffuse map for physically based rendering systems shouldn't have any baked lighting information in it. So no more ambient occlusion maps or cavity maps baked onto your diffuse maps, since that will only mess up the shaders. So a diffuse map should represent the color of the surface when lit with a 100% bright white light. As you can see, there's a image of a brick wall or a brick texture converted to a physically based rendering brick wall. So all the shadows and highlights have been removed, and the saturation have been lowered, and the contrast have been lowered as well. So it matches pretty well that red clay tile albedo. And here's the example what can happen if your albedo is too low. So I have 2 rock textures here, or rock spheres here. And the one on the left uses a scanned rock data from Megascans, and the one on the right uses the same texture maps, yet it still seems to have a lot more specular reflection. And this is because I made the albedo map a lot darker, and then I had to compensate the dark albedo with brightening up the lights, which results to this. So basically it almost looks like it's wet. So it's important to use the correct values and not compensate the darkness with lights or any other effects such as that. Then moving on to reflection. The reflection values are usually based on the index of refraction that materials have. And this is a lot of math and magic, how these things actually turn to values that we artists use. But I'll be focusing on the workflows that have changed from the traditional model. So with the specular workflow, which is quite common to the traditional model we have with the specular maps. And the biggest differences are that if you have a pure metal material, the diffuse should be set to black or 0. And the specular map uses a full range of colors. So the specular map defines the intensity and color of the specular map, of the reflection, just like in the traditional model. But again, what's different is that this specular map generally should be flat colors compared to the traditional model where we put all the detail, like scratches and whatever, to the actual specular map. And this is because the reflectivity of the material doesn't actually change that much. It's almost pretty constant per material. And then there's the metallic workflow, which is what, for example, Unreal Engine 4 uses. So Unreal Engine 4 no longer uses specular maps. So the metallic map is basically a mask So it uses only values 0 or 1, so black and white. And the values of 0, so basically your insulators, get a fixed reflectance value. And in Unreal Engine 4's case, it's 4%. And the value of 1 get the intensity and color from the diffuse map. So basically, it combines the specular map for the metals with the diffuse map of the insulators. And as you can see, I have 2 spheres there, which are actually using different materials, even though they look the same. So the result is pretty much the same. And as you can see, the upper one uses the specular workflow. So the diffuse is set to black, and the specular is around 60% of reflectivity. And again, in the metallic workflow, the 60% reflectivity is put into the diffuse map, and the specular map is completely white, so it's a metal. Here's a bit better reference for it. So as you can see, the results are the same. Again, it's the same camera lens we saw earlier. And you can see some difference on the paint, because the metallic map sacrifices the ability to change the reflectivity of the insulators. But again, it makes it easier to use, since you can pack it into a one channel of a RGB image. And you can also see there's a simple chart for some of the colors used by metals. I think that was for Unreal Engine 4. And finally, we have the Microsurface, which is a grayscale map with values 0 to 1. And it has the tiny imperfections that you can see, so basically the base roughness, you could call it, as well as the surface variation. So this is where you put all your artistic talent to. So basically all the scratches and wear and tear should go to the Microsurface map now. Because if you have a block of plastic or block of wood and you somehow scratch it, it doesn't really change the material. It's still the same. It still has the same albedo as well as the same reflectivity, because the material doesn't change. And this is really powerful map because it directly affects the apparent brightness of the reflection as well as the sharpness of the reflection. So Microsurface has pretty much become the most important texture map you have. Again, it's important to use some sort of reference charts, and this is because of the multiple implementation. So pretty much all the engines have their own way to calculate how the texture map actually works. So map created for Unreal Engine 4 might not work in CryEngine or Unity 5. So to recap that, so measured physically based values is the big thing. And it's quite important to use some sort of reference sheets to create your texture maps. Otherwise, you will most likely get incorrect values and the materials will look off. Some of the old approximations can now be discarded because we have the more computing power, so no more lighting data on your diffuse map, no more ambient occlusions or cavity maps baked onto the actual diffuse map. What hasn't changed is the 4 inputs, so we still have diffuse, reflection, microsurface, and normals, even though they're used quite differently. Coming to a conclusion, so physically based rendering is a new standard. Basically, all the bigger game engines have moved on to it, and it's a concept based on real-world values and a realistic shading. It brings us energy conservation, so no light leaving a surface is never brighter than which fell upon it originally, as well as Fresnel, which is that the reflectivity of a surface is view-dependent. And the benefits of using a physically based rendering system is the consistency it gives us between different lighting environments. Also, since the values are measurable, it makes it easier for artists to understand the parameters they're working with. And these two combined, it makes it a lot easier to achieve for the realistic results. But what's problematic is the different implementations that they have. So all of the companies have their own naming for things and their own algorithms, how they work, which makes it really hard for artists to move between engines. So this is really the basics of what physically based rendering is and how the workflow has changed from a traditional model. So if you have any questions, please do ask. Just a moment. Just a moment, he'll bring the mic.
Is it practical to scan the values yourself, or do you usually like buy or somehow somewhere download pre-scanned values for surfaces?
I'd say it's a lot easier to use pre-scan because the settings to take the correct values is actually quite hard. Basically, the diffuse might be the easiest one because it only needs a certain lighting setup and a Macbeth chart to take the actual correct how much light does the surface actually reflect as a diffuse reflection. But for metals and stuff like that, internet is full of the details, so you don't really need to look that far.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions? No? All right. Well, if you don't have any more questions or have questions, you can ask me after this thing. But if you find physical-based rendering interesting, here's some of the reference I used for this presentation. So the internet is full of information, so it's not really hard. Just type physical-based rendering to Google, and it will tell you all you ever need to know. So, but anyways, thank you for listening, and have a good assembly.